And we're going live. And we're
All right.
live.
And we are live. Hello, everybody. Josh
Hello,
Weston,
everyone.
And my pet armadillo is here as well.
Oh, no. I think he's hungry.
I think so. Alejandro's a regular on the podcast.
Well, and you know, they are a fixture in the Ozarks now.
Yes, yes, they are. Yes, they are. He's a little brass armadillo that keeps me company. He's good luck.
Self-isolation has been rough, hasn't it, Josh?
Nobody to talk to but my brass armadillo. Alejandro says hello to everyone.
Okay.
Oh my God. But it's great to see you, Lisa.
It's good seeing you, Josh. And Alejandro.
Yes, yes. Alejandro tends to be very opinionated, and he believes in cryptids. So
good. Well, he might have a commentary today.
He might. we'll see. Yeah. Yeah. Self-isolation has not been good to me. But we've got some cool topics to talk about.
Yes, strange tales out of the Ozarks.
Mm-hmm. And something that has been so consistent with each of these, this confluence of actual experience and then folklore, is you really start to see the ties, both for the indigenous peoples who were here, mm-hmm. and then also the peoples who moved into the region, and those ties, whether those ties go back to the Caribbean and Africa, whether those ties go back to Europe, or I think something that would be interesting to really dig into that many people may not realize is that at least two of the large Native American groups, of course, the Cherokee and the Delaware, were moved into this region by the U.S. federal government.
Mm-hmm. They were moved in here, and then other groups that were here had moved here to stay ahead of expansion too. So
yeah,
you had tribes that had been here for a very, very long time, and then you had tribes that moved in between 200 and 300 years ago, and then
mm-hmm.
then of course you had the Trail of Tears in the 1830s.
Yeah, yeah, and the Delaware were moved in around 1820,
mm-hmm.
into the James and White River valleys, and of course that's where we get probably the base for the Bread Train Mountain legend,
right?
Or a beginning of that. But each people group comes with their own set, certainly of religious structure, folklore, belief, and it seems that every people group has some similarities when it comes to things like cryptids, little people, and fairies.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess we should do a little bit of a shout out, just since we are the Dark Ozarks, that
yes.
The word Ozarks actually comes from the Osage Indians.
Yeah.
And it was a sort of a French then English translation of Osage that became Ozarks.
Mm-hmm.
And they were very prominent on the western side of the Ozarks and in the Sitz River area, that's in the area I'm at, the Sitz Rivers. And the Osage were a little bit different than a lot of the other tribes too. They were one of the civilized tribes originally in the South, but they were much more aggressive,
mm-hmm.
Asserting themselves, and we don't really think of it, but of course, on the high plains, we had Indians that scalped, etc., like Custer's Last Stand. But the Osage, particularly after they felt like the federal government had done them wrong in 1803, they bought the land from them and pushed them west into what's now Kansas and Oklahoma. They realized their hunting lands weren't very good, and they came back. They pushed back in the 1830s, and we actually had the Osage Indian Wars in the Ozarks. And they tended to behead their enemies.
Yes.
And that
even as late
Civil War too.
What's that?
And that became an issue in the Civil War at times too.
Right. That's what I was going to say. That continued into the Civil War, and obviously it's coming from two different places, but the Celts had a long tradition with a severed head.
Yes. And I'm not really sure, maybe a bad phrase, but which was the chicken and the egg? I'm not really sure where, if the Osage's practice predated contact with the Scotch Irish or not, but they were from the South, and so they had interacted with settlers who were the people ultimately that settled here. So
right.
Again, there's a similarity there that the practice was certainly not unknown to settlers in this area historically.
Right. And it could just as easily be, completely separate culturally, but but sharing the similarities. But I do think it's interesting, and I feel like the Osage, to a degree, certainly the Cherokee, oftentimes found an affinity, a cultural affinity, or the Scotch Irish, the outliers, the Scotch Irish who had suffered extraordinary persecution under British rule and were accustomed to being those people, those disenfranchised people on the fringes, that they did at times share a very strong affinity with the Cherokee. And and of course that's one of those areas where, as you begin to dig into it, it gets really, depending on your perspective, it could get very messy, because, again, referencing our tagline, sometimes there are no easy answers. These people groups, as they're interacting with with one another, would form very unexpected alliances that do not fit with our contemporary mindset.
Very true, and certainly that certainly came out in the Civil War, as the tribes aligned, some with the Union, some with the Confederacy. And with the Confederacy, the Cherokee, for one, was prominent, that pretty well sided with the Confederates. And you had General Stande Watte, who was a Confederate general.
And I think that, go ahead.
No, I was just clearing my throat.
I think that really speaks the act of the U.S. government in regards to Native American relocation, sometimes very brutal, obviously with the Trail of Tears, created a very deep-seated emotional response against Washington and against the federal government. So when the Confederacy came along, I think in many cases it just made sense. This was a powerful group that was opposed to those who had relocated them.
Exactly. And then you had like this Osage who basically, for the most part, didn't take a side. And then you had some of the Delaware and some of the Creek that some fought for the Union. So we would have battles in the Ozarks that you had Indian brigades on both sides. So
now, and it's it really, history is messy, and folklore is messy, and being able to break it down and say these are the good guys and those are the bad guys. It doesn't work like that.
No, not at all. But that sort of looking at that lay of the land, you know, I think a jumping off point on our topic would be little people.
Absolutely. Shared folklore and a shared belief system between both Irish, Scots, Cherokee, and you've done a lot of research in this area.
Mm-hmm.
So
well,
tell me about that.
Well, basically, you have a common thread of little people, and with the Scotch Irish, particularly the Irish, there was a belief in fairies and pixies and so forth, but particularly fairies, that they interfered in the affairs of men.
Yes.
And in the old country, they were very much viewed as something to be wary of, to give wide berth. There's a reverence, a mutual reverence with Native Americans for the sanctity of tree groves and so forth. And that comes into play with fairies in the old country. You have fairy groves, which are circles of trees. And it was believed that the fairies lived there. And so it was bad luck to build a house between two fairy groves.
Yes, because they're going between the two.
And then they tended to play tricks and cause trouble. There are stories of...
I know, I would.
Well, yeah, I mean, it would be tempting. But
Yeah.
fairies would tempt people into the forest, would tempt them to get lost. And you know, you have tales that this is kind of the tradition that Rumpelstiltskin came out of.
Yes.
You know, which is sort of the, you know, an iconic colonial American tale, but it's basically based in Irish belief.
It is.
It is. That this is what could happen to you. Mm-hmm. And often, you know, there were stories that, you know, they could trick people, you know, kidnap children and play tricks and so forth. And if you asked a favor, they literally would give you what you asked for, but there were usually repercussions that you didn't like. And very independent of that, a lot of Native Americans, and the Cherokee in particular, had a very similar belief. And yes, they referred to them as little people. And they generally would be described as 2 to 3 feet tall, look identical to Indians. And it was very much something that you did not want to have an encounter with. Mm-hmm. One of the more infamous tales is with Chief John Ross of the Cherokees after they had gotten to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. And you have to, the Cherokee, the elders, they were landed aristocracy back east. They had plantations. They were slave owners. A lot of them were very wealthy, or had been. And Ross and some of his friends went out fox hunting in Oklahoma. And the tale goes that they rode over a hill and came on a group of little people. And he stopped the party, turned everyone around, rode back to his house, and just told everyone we'd never speak of this. Obviously, someone did, but you know, it's one of those things. If you mention them, it's bad luck type thing. And then there are tales that are very much like hoodoo and voodoo with the little people, with the Cherokee, of being able to summon them. and that you can summon them with offerings of candy and tobacco, things like that. So that tradition is very much akin to the hoodoo from the European background as well as the slave culture. So, I mean, very much similar belief systems there.
And of course, with with the Irish, it tends to be offerings of cream or whiskey.
Right, but very, and that's interesting too, because in hoodoo and voodoo, the offerings are either alcohol, usually rum, or food that is white. It would be milk or eggs or rice, typically, and being white for, I guess, I'm not really sure, purity or good intent, probably, but very similar. And so, I mean, there are tales that even modern tales of people in certain places trying to summon the little people in the Ozarks. And, one of those is the Devil's Promenade Bridge, in particular. That there are tales that, I mean, there are other tales regarding the promenade, but one is that you can stand in the middle of the bridge at night, make an offering, and summon the little people, and they will grant a wish.
Right.
But once again, if they do, be careful what you wish for.
Well, and I think from veering over into a sort of a cultural learning area, so many of the times you see lessons that are meant to be, brought out of this. Lessons like appreciation of nature, lessons of responsibility.
Exactly. Well, and just teaching of wisdom, discernment, and not always don't always believe what you see.
and sometimes you don't want what you think you want.
Exactly. Sort of the old adage, even, the devil comes dressed as an angel, you have to beware.
And from an Irish perspective, veering off a little bit, well, there's a couple of things I wanted to land on. One is the traditional Celtic mythology of Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth, and
yes.
that is the place of the Tuatha De Danann, the great gods of Celtic mythology, which then began to get shared with the idea of the Faeries, or crossing over from a Celtic pantheon into a rural folklore belief. And
yes.
we see an interesting jumping all over the place, but there's really interesting evidence that suggests that the same thing happened, of course, with Ireland. When the Catholic Church became omnipresent, it said, okay, here is the church structure, and then you see a rural or agrarian belief structure of the old gods underneath it. But in Italy, the same thing happened, but not with the Catholic Church, but with the urban belief system of the Roman deities. And you had the Roman deities at the top, which represented sort of modernity at the time, and then you had the rural belief system, which was to a certain degree was Etruscan, and that's the belief of the peasants. But I think that there's a lot to be learned from the rural people.
Yes, definitely. I mean, there's a wisdom and an understanding of the world around them that often gets lost in the urban setting. And I think obviously, Native Americans retain that sense much longer than a lot of other groups. But
I agree.
when you're in areas like the Ozarks that remain more sheltered for a long time physically, I think you retain more of that. And that certainly did. But it's interesting that you have those parallels between the different groups, and they seem to not be borrowed from each other.
Exactly. And you see that often. A lot of similarities in structure. Of course, one of the things, and I know we're going to get into this, especially as we go. Bigfoot is ubiquitous.
Yes.
Questions about Bigfoot, almost to the point. And first of all, just in case anybody wonders, I'm very open-minded in terms of cryptozoology. I think there's a lot of possibilities, and I think there's a lot of possibilities outside of the people who are very super skeptical or like that just doesn't exist. But I feel like Bigfoot, and to a certain degree Momo, have almost moved into the area of urban legend.
I think they have. Well, for a lot of people, they have. And, actually, a lot of legends in the Ozarks, younger people, even ones that have a factual basis of that some event happened, some experience happened, many people just take it as, a recent urban legend. But there are sightings of wild men and different Bigfoot type cryptids that go back as far as people have been here, in Missouri and Arkansas and down in Oklahoma. Not so much that I know of in eastern Kansas, and I don't know about southern Illinois, but I know all of those other areas definitely, and including to this day. There's newspaper accounts of encounters that settlers and loggers and miners had with what people today would describe as Bigfoot, going back to the mid 1800s. And you have the Blue Man in southern Missouri that a lot of people are not really familiar with anymore. But starting in the 1860s, he was encountered between the 1860s and about the 1920s, off and on a regular basis in the rural areas. Tended to be stumbled upon by hunting parties or mining parties or logging parties. And, some people have said, well, I think it was all made up. But on the other hand, there's enough accounts that were documented, it does make you wonder. And not a real reason to make it up, and not people who tried to capitalize on it or get fame off of it or anything.
Right.
We have a few questions.
Okay.
Good question. How does folklore begin?
I think it comes from a lot of basis, a lot of core base. I think disenfranchised religious structure would be the biggest. We see that with Italian folklore originating from disenfranchised rural Etruscans coming underneath Roman rule. We see that with the Celtic peoples, with a Celtic pantheon and a Druidic structure of religious belief coming under a British rule and coming under Catholicism, and I think obviously the situation of Native Americans coming under American governmental rule.
I agree, and I think even if you look further afield, I think another thing that happens is sometimes folklore, it comes from those spiritual beliefs, and sometimes something will happen, like when you're talking about, say, a cryptid. There's some event that part of the story gets retained and passed on. A good example totally unrelated to the Ozarks, but illustrates it well, is the city of Troy.
Mhm.
You know, for 2,000 years, people assumed that Troy was basically myth, that the story of Troy and the Trojan Wars and everything was basically myth. And, in the last 15, 20 years, they've pretty well found the location of Troy, figured out that that's where Homer was talking about, and that the city predated even his account by 2 or 3,000 years. So, but it had been destroyed at some point. So something happened, and oral tradition carried on some of the details of that, which morph into folklore and legend. And so I think that happens everywhere. So it's a combination of being disenfranchised. I can't talk. A certain predisposition for oral story, I think, and plus sometimes that grain of truth.
And on that, I think, especially as modern people who are led to believe that we control the world around us, that it is very it's very easy to look down on those beliefs. It's very easy to degrade various religions for a variety of reasons, without realizing that religion is the human way of attempting to understand what is a very complex reality. And when you take people groups that had thousands of years to develop these belief structures, there were reasons that they believed what they did. And probably better formed reasons than we have today for believing things like, where does our toilet paper come from in Walmart? And we look at ancient peoples and we say that they're primitive without the introspection and the reflection and the realization that we're a lot closer to barbarity and primitivism than we want to admit. And some of these, some of the base of our folklore and our ancient peoples, these were highly, highly sophisticated, incredibly intelligent individuals.
Right. And a lot closer to us than sometimes we're comfortable with saying, too. Other questions? Okay. Other question. Do we compare Native American Little People with Irish fairies, say H.C. Andersen's fairy tales, fairies? Fairies have sort of morphed in British tradition.
Yes.
And over time, they kind of morphed in sort of the more friendly, more tame, more magical, beautiful sense. And that's another thing originally, that European fairies were not, they weren't cute little Disney characters, and that we think of today. And it seems to be in the Victorian period that it seems that you start getting a change in how they're represented.
Definitely a romanticization.
I think so, and in part too, I think it comes from a sense that we control nature more now, and so they are more like a part of nature, and not necessarily affecting man. I think it kind of came from there.
And I would agree, that that sense of sort of the magical beings that you would go out to your beautiful Victorian garden and appreciate, as opposed to the magical beings that you encounter on the way to a sacred grove and you're terrified of.
Right, right. And, you know, the symbols of the groves and so forth in circular areas, you know, that goes back to Neolithic periods in the Isles. So, I mean, the original tradition goes back so far. It's hard to know where the concept of the not so nice fairy really came from. Other questions?
Mm-hmm. All predates. And I just wanted to throw in, I think for people who'd be interested in reading, that the works of W.B. Yeats would probably be a little more aligned with Celtic folklore, which is also more aligned with some of the Cherokee legends and folklore, and especially the book Celtic Twilight would be. I don't have it right in front of me, but Celtic Twilight is an excellent book by W.B. Yeats.
Yeah, I agree. Another question. Oh, and that's a good question. Do we feel like there's a relationship between stories of the cryptids in the area and phenomena such as the spook light?
I think so. What do you think?
I think possibly. And I'm kind of torn there because part of me, I feel that the phenomena of the spook light probably ultimately will be science-based, some sort of geological function or something that the right conditions create it in certain areas, because you do have these ghost lights or earth lights in a few places around the country and around the world. They've even have them in Asia. But it is interesting, the area where the spook light, and for people who aren't familiar, the Joplin spook light or the Hornet spook light is a phenomena that the Indians have known about for hundreds of years in the area. It was first documented by the U.S. and white settlers in the 1830s along the Trail of Tears, because the march went through that area, and it's documented of seeing phenomena like that. But where it typically is seen is it ranges over a several square mile area, and very close to it are other places that are associated with cryptids. One being the Goat Man. There's an area close by that's the Goat Man Holler, and it's on native land. And the Goat Man is reported to be a Sasquatch type creature with sheep horn type horns. And I can tell you, I've been there, and several people, you know, in my group have been there, invited. And no, I didn't see it, but I can tell you, as we were hiking into the holler through the ravine, there was something that seemed to be tracking us on the top of the ravine, and the trees were thick enough. Yes, we tried to get all kinds of pictures, didn't get anything, but everyone that was in that group, and there were probably about 10 or 12 of us, had heard something walking up there, saw brush moving in a way that didn't make sense with the wind conditions, that kind of thing. And it started shortly as we got into the ravine and followed us all the way into the holler. I'd love to say I saw it, but I didn't. But I've heard tales from natives who have had encounters, and including an account where Department of Natural Resources had come in because there's a stream at the bottom of the ravine and it needed to be dredged because it was flooding. And so they had some guys down there working, and gunshots were heard. And so residents went down to see what was going on, and the men were coming out of the ravine looking very shocked and wide-eyed, and described the goat man, saying that that they had come across it, kind of gone over a rise, and it was there. They kept a 22 with them in case they ran into some, because we do have black bear, etc. And someone shot at it. They swore that it got hit in the shoulder. It screamed, roared, and ran off. And they said they wouldn't come back without shotguns. So I assume that they saw something, and I would assume that it wasn't a bear. These would be guys that would know if they had run into a black bear.
Yeah, very, very true. And black bears are pretty easy to identify. Yeah. That one reminds me, and this was a post that was actually done over here at Kirbyville in March. We've talked about this before, but I'm still fascinated by it. And what made me think of it again was the bushes and trees. You mentioned the bushes and trees moving in an unusual way. This was a post by an individual named Misty. It said, I live in Kirbyville and took a walk with my son and our dogs. We live in a wooded area. We heard loud noises in the tree line, and the bushes and trees were moving. So we turned around and headed home. The noise followed us. So did the movement of the trees. Yes. From my yard, we turned to look, and there was an animal about the size of a 7 or 8 year old kid. The animal was white blonde, but there wasn't enough light to clearly see it. I could only tell the color, and this was, I think, significant, and it was standing on its hind legs.
That is, that's interesting. That's very interesting.
And that really is an area that moves outside of both urban legend and folklore. We're dealing with a cryptid sighting that is completely outside of both of your traditional structures.
Mm-hmm. Someone asked where we were with the goat man, and it's on private land that is maybe 4 or 5 miles from the prominent sighting area for the spook light. I can't really go into more detail than that because it was private land. I don't have permission, but suffice it to say, it's just within a very small area. Like I said, about 4 or 5 miles from where you typically would go to watch for the spook light. And also right in that same area, there are tales of the deer woman. And, yes. And this is very much in the bailiwick of Native American lore as well as Celtic lore. It's a forest creature, and a woman, and some versions she has like deer antlers and so forth. And there are some tales there that it may be the spirit of a woman who died there under bad circumstances, perhaps at the hands of her husband or what. I've heard various tales, but to me, the core of it is it's the deer woman and that typical forest spirit. And I'll let you talk a little bit. I think that's very much a crossover between all the belief systems.
It really, there's so much potential for crossover. What it makes me think of is Kronos, Celtic god of the forest, who of course is seen with antlers, a man with antlers. And this is a little bit of outside, but there is a cryptid / folkloric creature called the Snoffus, which is a white deer that lives up in the trees.
Yeah, that one's always fascinated me a little bit. And maybe that's, who knows, maybe that's what we're seeing in Kirbyville.
It might be. We found the Snoffus. And coming back to what the first question about the phenomena potentially being connected. Something that I find very interesting, and I think that there's a lot of a belief structure in place for it is the idea of liminal spaces, the idea of spaces in which the thinning of the veil between one world and the next. And I have wondered at times if those spaces do not experience a higher degree of unique slash, what we would call paranormal or crypto zoological events.
Well, and that plus just if there is, and I can say I've seen the spook light a number of times over the years, but you have a phenomenon like that. Why wouldn't, if there is a Sasquatch type creature there, why wouldn't it be drawn to that area too? I mean, people have gone down there for almost 200 years to try to look at the spook light. I'm not so sure that, Bigfoot wouldn't as well, or the goat man, or to be near that kind of energy. I mean, I think it would be intriguing. It's sort of like, there's a theory in ufology and Bigfoot research too, that there's a correlation between UFO sightings and Bigfoot sightings.
Right.
Often, if there's a UFO sighting, cryptid sightings go up shortly afterwards. And so you get some theories, well, Bigfoot's is a alien or this or that, or they're working together. And I've always just kind of looked at it, well, if there's a strange light in the sky, we go out and look at it. Why wouldn't he?
Very, very true. And one of that, bringing that up, one of the most compelling and interesting but open-ended arguments that I have heard, or suggestions that I've heard, is the comparison, something that traditional Celtic peoples feared was an abduction by the fairies. You go out and the fairies take you, and and then after a while they bring you back. This is echoed in Rumpelstiltskin, or not Rumpelstiltskin, Rip Van Winkle, in the fact of missing time, and a very unusual experience. And one of the concepts that I heard, and I just find it interesting, is that some sort of phenomena may occur that the human mind simply cannot comprehend. And so, for lack of a better word, when our mind tries to piece it together afterwards, it goes home to mama. It goes home to what it understands. And if the folklore that the person grew up with was tales of fairy abductions, then maybe that's how the mind pieces that experience together. Or if it's grown up with stories of UFOs, maybe that's how the mind pieces it together.
Oh, I think there definitely is something to that. I think, there was one other, I know we were going to talk about Iwa and some of those subjects, and that's something that a lot of people may not be quite as familiar with. And it's when we talk about the spirit world and even paranormal activity, Native American beliefs in this area, in this region, are pretty interesting and complex. And how tribal elders have described it to me is you have more than one kind of spirit. Ancestor spirits are pretty much what the European ghost would be, and they are, in their opinion, spirit. They, it's not a physical form, that kind of thing. But there are other things that are more akin to what we would call shadow men, that are not so simple in their terms. And for instance, the Quapaw tribe, they refer to these entities as the Iwa. And I find the Iwa fascinating. I've actually researched had a case that involved sightings of what appeared to be a Iwa, and there were definitely things that you couldn't explain in that one. But basically Iwa are a combination of something physical and something spirit.
Mhm.
They would say no, they are not physical, but like you and I, but basically they're dense, they have mass, so that if you reach out and touch an Iwa, there's form there. And they often appear like shadow men, or some people would almost say, otherworldly creature. Sometimes have a sort of a scary appearance. And they seem to be there more as tricksters. And they again, it's a bit like the idea of the little people and the fairies, that you have spirit that, ancestors, etc., that this is fine, we can deal with this, but we have these others that don't fit that box, and be wary of them. And maybe they can trick you, they can take you away, that kind of thing. So it's a similar idea in a way.
It is, and it really speaks to this idea. I think our modern mindset, we keep trying to put things in specific boxes,
Right.
and say if it's going to either be in this box here. So, for example, it's going to be in physical or it's going to be in spiritual. And if it can't be in this one, it has to be in that one. If it can't be found in this one, it doesn't exist in that one. Case
Right.
closed. And our quote unquote more primitive people, our ancient peoples, I don't think that argument would make sense to them.
No, it just is. It just is.
And I love when people ask, do you think it's this or do you think it's that? And my answer typically is yes.
Mm-hmm. And that's definitely would be the answer there for the Quapaw on Iwa. Yes.
Mhm.
Both is true. Do we have any other questions? Okay. We don't have any more questions right now. I guess
Okay.
we've been running for almost 50 minutes. So believe
Yes,
it or not.
yes, we have.
So we will be on Instagram Live on Wednesday, and we will be announcing a book giveaway that we'll give away next week. And everyone, that if you have questions, if you have topics you want us to talk about, send us messages. We're happy to talk about them and
Absolutely.
And explore it. So we sure appreciate everybody.
Yes, we do. Thank you guys for watching. And thanks, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Bye.
See y'all.